Welcome back to another episode from Ampro Engineering. In this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about these two cars, the Tamiya Grasshopper 2 and the Tamiya Super Hornet. Both a pair that I really tend to enjoy designing things for, as these two cars really over their lives had no, at least to my knowledge, no aftermarket or hop-ups to speak of. And I always really like kind of focusing on cars that have been overlooked over the years. You know, both of these did get a double wishbone front suspension. The Grasshopper got, significantly more upgrades, but there was always that really annoying thing that affects all of these cars. These cars, much like the Hornet and the Midnight Pumpkin Lunchbox, they all have the same problem. And it's not really a problem, I guess. It's more of a grievance. When you accelerate with any of these cars, save for the Grasshopper, the original one, you will hear this. Because as the motor rotates, the transmission swings up on these little sliders right here, and you always get that whack every single time you accelerate, and it drives me insane. What I have done is resolved that for these cars as well. This part is remarkably simple. This is the transmission retainer for the Grasshopper 2 and the Super Hornet. You can see it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and those of you who have the CW01 transmission retainer or the Hornet transmission retainer will note that this geometry right here is the same as the ones on those two vehicles, and the reason for that is it is the same transmission and the same basic principle. There is some other geometry here that we'll get into its fundamental reason why it is designed the way it is, because there's some peculiarity in this design, but it's all for a good reason. I'm going to begin installing this on the Super Hornet because the Super Hornet has some problems, and we're going to begin with that right now. The Super Hornet's rear suspension is a bit unique in terms of Tamiya cars. You can see here that it has this bracket which extends the shock travel and mount from the top part of the chassis down to this area back here, as opposed to the Grasshopper 2, which is very much like the original Hornet style lower shock mount. With that said, let's go ahead and see how the suspension works on the Super Hornet. Now, I'm going to let the axle just you can see it right there. I'm going to let the axle just float about a bit. I'm going to compress the suspension just like that. What I want you to notice is I'm going to hold it down here and just kind of roll the car forward. Notice that the suspension is not fully compressed. Let's do that again so you can see it. Let's extend it all the way out. And again, I will push down on the body. So you've still got a good, let's call that 7 millimeters of travel that are simply not being consumed because of the shock geometry with respect to this pivot point here. The next thing I'm going to do is hold the transmission in its fully down state. You can see it's resting in the lower part of this little slider. Now I'm going to push down on the back of the body, and you can see that the shocks fully compress. What this means is that the installation of this transmission brace, centralizing the transmission, will force the axle to do kind of a similar thing as it did before, and you're not going to get complete compression of the shocks. You are going to get between 4 and 6 millimeters of travel back here that are unused. Step one, let's pull the body off, and let's remove the entire transmission by pulling off both of these side plates. Got both of these plates loose now. Let's pull them out, and the transmission is going to be free. The geometry of the Super Hornet as well as the Grasshopper 2 will pretty much allow you to kind of flip the transmission over. I'm going to just unplug both of these motor wires, and this will allow the transmission to kind of just drop straight down and out of my way if you're like me and too lazy to unscrew these shocks. This here is the area where we're going to be placing the retainer. Move the battery door. You'll notice a small tab here at the leading edge of the chassis. I suspect that this is originally for the rubber band that would hold the receiver pack in place. There is a small notch right here which will allow it to slot right in there and remedy all possible alignment problems. There's no way to put this in incorrectly. Simply drop it in there, hold it down, and mark your 2 holes. Speaking of your 2 holes, on the right side we have a hole with a round boss, and on the left side we have a hole that doesn't have one. The reason why this hole does not have the round boss is because the edge of the transmission right here has this protrusion that will come into contact with a boss if this side had one as well. Two options. You can either use both screw holes and thread into them from the inside, making sure that when you thread through this one here, it does not go past this front, or this rear face, I should say. So it must be completely flat right here. This one should be about as flush, but if it does protrude slightly, you're not going to have nearly the problem as this central one. I don't like putting holes in my cars, so I'm only going to use the one on the right. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use a spudger here to mark the center of the hole, but if you've got a fine tip silver marker, this will work equally as well. So I'm just going to put a little indentation right here. And if there's a little bit of light, yeah, there is, you can see it right there. This is the hole that I'm going to drill in the chassis, and I'm going to use a 3.15 millimeter drill bit. If you have standard drill bits, just use an 1/8 inch. The hole here doesn't need to be as accurate because we're threading from the inside of the chassis outward. There's the hole drilled, and I will now slot that right back into place. I can use a self-tapping screw, but you do want to use a bit of a smaller one here. This is a 12 millimeter long self-tapping screw. If you do want to use one, you might want to cut off the leading 4 millimeters and then test fit to make sure that it doesn't protrude. I am actually going to use a machine screw because I've tapped a portion of this. This is a M3. And in using the M3, I'm basically just using this because I happen to have screws that are short, that are also machined, so that's going to work just fine. Since this is not a high torque situation, this will be perfect. So let me just thread that in, and I'll be right back. I have threaded this into place here. I am only using the right side hole. I really don't feel like the left one is necessary for my application because since the lower edge of this retainer is coming into contact with this back edge of the transmission, the forces applied on this are so minimal that there's not going to be any torquing. If you have any concern, you're more than welcome to use the interior one as well. I also wanted to mention these little torsion springs right here. These are no longer. Let's pull that out. Since we have some access to this battery area, I also want to note that 0 modification is necessary to the battery door or anything related to it. The only modification to your entire car is 1 hole or 2 holes if you so choose. I will now rotate the transmission up a bit. Slot that in right there. On the right side, we'll put in that. So in terms of articulation, left and right, full articulation. There's no loss whatsoever. This, in its neutral position right now, is smack dab in the center. And as you can see, you've still got your complete suspension travel, but again, no more slop in this area of the transmission. Put your screws back in and let's see how this thing works. I just realized something completely unintended. Usually when the Super Hornet is sitting there, the transmission is slotted all the way up, and because of how the rear suspension geometry is, that means the car usually sits right around here. But because now the transmission is locked in the central position, this car is a good 7 or 8 millimeters higher than it would normally be. I think it looks fantastic. Let's take a look at the rear suspension. You can see that we still get, actually this is way better than I thought. Look at this. Wait a minute. That can't be. Okay, I am evidently wrong. It is getting nearly its entire shock travel. I thought it was going to get 6 or so millimeters. Wow, no, it's actually almost hitting the whole thing. It's probably around 3 millimeters off. That's awesome. All right, very excited about that. We shall begin with the Grasshopper, and as you can see, this transmission, nice and floppy. Oh wow, that's nice. All right, well, let's try that out here. I'm just tapping the throttle. Not annoying at all. Next is our Super Hornet, and you can see the transmission goes up and down, left and right, but no sloppiness in the middle. This one has no reverse, so bear with me. So I'll just tap the throttle. Just hold it right here. There you have it. I went ahead and did the same thing to the Grasshopper 2, and you can see from the top how there's a little notch right here, and that is to prevent any modification to the battery door. I hope you enjoyed this upgrade. This is proof that people annoying me constantly about making a transmission brace for the Grasshopper 2 and the Super Hornet eventually does pay off. Yes, maybe it takes a few months, but people, I am there for you. And I'm there for me. I love these cars, but it's always one of those things where just driving them kind of annoys me. You might notice that there is a third car missing here, and that would be the brother from another era, the Rising Fighter. Same chassis, different transmission. Don't worry, those of you with the Rising Fighter, the next episode is specifically aimed at that car. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to this channel and go ahead and add me on Instagram and Facebook at AmProEngineering. And before you take off, check out the band Blue Pinto. You know who they are and you know where the link to their webpage is. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.